Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another week of Record Live. I hope you are all doing well and keeping warm this winter. Jesse, thank you for coming back to join us on Record Live. You are returning as my co-host again this time.
You can't keep me away, Zanita. Great to be here.
We are joined with another special guest. We are joined with Catalina today, who is a counsellor on the Northern Rivers. So, Catalina, welcome to Record Live. I believe this is your first time with us.
It is, and it's a very exciting time. So I'm going to try and not be like a fangirl and get all excited to be on here. But thank you so much for inviting me on here. And the topic is, it's something I'm really keen on talking a little bit about.
Yeah, we are talking about a very important topic. We were talking about forgiveness for anyone who is just jumping on. But before we get into that, Catalina, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do? I already spilled the guts that you are from the Northern Rivers, but yeah, just tell us about yourself.
So I always say I'm an entrepreneur for the gospel, and I found myself doing a lot of different things. So I don't know if I can give you one thing, but at the moment, my primary focus is, I guess, just trying to make counseling be a space that's more approachable for Christians. I know it can be, there's a bit of a stigma associated getting professional help for things like mental illness and those kind of struggles. And God put on my heart this conviction that if we just had more Christian and specifically more Seventh-day Adventist Christian counselors, that at least it was just another option for people to reach out to. So that's what I'm doing at the moment, and also working at Tweed Valley Adventist College part-time. So I have private practice and also working at the school.
Yeah, sounds like you're pretty busy then.
Just a bit.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I guess diving into this topic of forgiveness, I'm wondering if you have any, I guess, standout memories when it comes to forgiveness. Maybe it's like your first memory, or maybe it's something more recent. Just start us off with a little story, I guess.
Okay. So this question that you sent through, it really got me thinking, because as I kind of thought of forgiveness, there's not like one example of forgiveness that I could give you that is the same as any other example. So I found myself writing a list of the names of people that I've been working on forgiving and through that journey with, and every single person that was on that list, what forgiveness looks for them in the situation, and I guess in the circumstances that we had, looked very different. But there's one forgiveness that I'm going to share, and it's really hard because with forgiveness, it seems like this real simple label to put on the process that we go through, but it's actually really broad and it's so individual and personalized that I'm going to give you an example of forgiveness. Forgiveness for me has looked very different with different situations. But when I was 10, my dad was a mechanic, and we had just had a new driveway that had been laid down at our house. And Dad being a mechanic, there was a car that was coming to get fixed, and Dad said to me, he said, "Catalina, please make sure that when that person comes to drop their car off, that you ask them to park it on the side of the house where it was dirt." He's like, "Because it's got an oil leak. I just don't want oil leaking in our driveway." And I was like, "Yes, Dad, no worries. Like, I'll make sure I let them know." The people came, dropped their car off, and I totally forgot to tell them that we needed them to park on dirt so there wasn't this leak. 10-year-old me decides, you know what, I could totally move this car and park it on the side of the house where the dirt was. So I decided to do that. And I remember my grandma, it was a 2-story house, and I'm in the car, I'm getting ready to move it, and my grandma is yelling out to me from the top window, and she's saying, "Catalina, get out of the car. What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Grandma, I've got this. Like, it'll be fine." So I get it, and I try to maneuver the car around to the side of the house, and it's this awkward driveway entry. Like, it's just an adult would struggle getting it through because of the gate. It's a real tight squeeze. It's a real like sharp angle. Anyway, I'm trying to get it through, and I hit the front of this car, and it gets stuck on the post of the gate that goes into the side of our house. And I just remember, I'm like, I don't know what to do right now, because if I go forward, I'm going to scrape the side. If I try and reverse out of this, I'm going to pull the full bumper off. So I just like get out of the car, and I'm like, what do we do now? Neighbor comes over. They like try and get the car out of the way, still ends up doing more damage. Dad comes home. He's like, Catalina, what have you done? I'm like, Dad, it's just I didn't want to get the driveway dirty. And he's like, do you realize you've just smashed a car up instead of like, getting oil in the driveway? For that week, Dad is like, Catalina, when the owners of this car come and pick the car up, you're going to go downstairs. You're going to tell them what you did. And you're going to tell them how sorry you are for what you did. That week was the most tormenting week of my life. Like, it was so bad. And I was like thinking of what I'm going to say to these people. And I'm like, I'll probably just start crying. Like, I don't know what's going to happen. Comes the day where they pick up the car. Long story short, Dad managed to fix all the panels, got all the paint fixed. We managed to find parts. We got the car painted. So the car was like new when they came to pick it up. But Dad still, his request was that I go and let them know what had happened. So I'm upstairs. I've come to pick up the car. Dad's downstairs. I'm waiting for my dad to come up and get me, to tell me to come down and to tell the people what happened. And he never came. And I'm waiting and Al leaves, the people leaves. My dad comes up the stairs and I just look at him and he's like, Catalina, I told them that I crashed the car. I told them that I did it and that we fixed it. And if they weren't happy with the repairs, that we would happily refix anything that wasn't, up to their standard. They said it was fine. And when you ask the question, like, when's the first time that you experienced forgiveness? As I perceive forgiveness now, and what has been the most difficult type of forgiveness to actually partake of, it's that. It's where someone was willing to take the punishment for something that I had done, and yet I didn't deserve it. So yeah, that's my earliest memory, and I think the one that's really left a massive impact on me as an adult as I navigate through having to forgive people throughout my life.
Such a good story. I wasn't expecting it to end in that way. But yeah, love it. I think when I was thinking about forgiveness as well, you mentioned this before you told the story, how it can look different in so many circumstances. And I know when I experienced, like, I was hurt a few years ago and I was having to figure out how to forgive someone. For me, I was like, I kind of said the words in my head. The person wasn't sorry. So it was kind of those things that you had to do mentally. But like, I kind of said the words, prayed the prayer, but still felt like I hadn't really forgiven. And I was like, well, what do I do? Like, what is the process? Like, what does this look like? And I think that was the first time I really had to grapple with it. So I guess, can you go into that? Like, what does forgiveness actually look like? Is it just like saying it, praying it, and it's done? Or is it more of like a process than we actually think?
Yeah. So I guess as we get more into this discussion, I wanted to really just put out to your audience that there's no like cookie cutter template for what forgiveness should look like. And in the therapeutic space, when I sit with someone who has experienced some sort of trauma or some sort of like traumatic incident or event, or just relationship itself, it's very hard for me to assume that the steps that I give are going to be the best steps for everyone. So as we go into this conversation, I guess there's a part of me that also wants to put like a disclaimer that as much as we're going to talk through some key points, it's still very individual to everyone's experience. And I guess we can take some of those skills with us and try to implement them however we can into our specific situation. But there's also a part that, you have to journey in a way that's very individual to what you've experienced and also what that looks like for you long term. For example, if someone's, experienced sexual abuse, what one person experiences sexual abuse might be very different to someone else. And so even that has its complexity in trying to kind of, help people through that journey. But if we look at it in terms of like a psychological perspective and a psychosocial approach, forgiveness is generally like the absence of negative feelings and emotions towards someone. So not having resentment, bitterness, anger towards people. That's generally like a definition you would find in the American Journal of Psychology or the American Association of Psychology. Like, it's a very clinical definition. which sometimes doesn't really give us enough to personalize what forgiveness actually looks like, given our specific circumstances and the details of kind of what we have to work through. Biblically, it's kind of, there's more details, but then it's also more complicated because you'll find there's like 3 main words that are used for forgiveness. When we read it in the Bible, it just forgive, forgiven. But in terms of like the original Greek or the original Hebrew, there's actually 3 different types of forgiveness. And how they look is very different to what we would just assume forgiveness looks like. So there's a forgiveness for like straight out rebellion. There's a forgiveness that comes from evil and wickedness, and then there's a forgiveness that comes from offending. So then, yeah, what does that look for us? Again, super different to what we would apply.
And I guess in a spiritual sense as well, we have the, I forgive you for something that you've done to me. But then there's an existential sense of forgiveness for, large scale, we would call it sin in a Christian sense, evil, suffering, things that have happened existentially in our world. And we feel a sense of guilt for that. I also want to just quickly ask, maybe this is obvious for you or for most people, but why is forgiveness, I don't know if necessary is the right word, but why is it good for good health, psychologically, or even physically, potentially? Why is it important for us to forgive, or is it?
It's super important, but I do believe that they're trying to work through forgiveness can be more painful than actually addressing what's happened to us. So you'll often find people who struggle to forgive, it's because it's even more painful for them to address what's happened. And that might be just to really sit down and assess what the offense is. So if there's like infidelity in a relationship, some people might hold on to bitterness and resentment because it seems like a more protective emotion than to have to deal with the vulnerability of what it looked like to actually recognize, acknowledge, and accept the betrayal that came through infidelity. So I understand why forgiveness can be hard for some people and why they would avoid it, because it's the better of the two, I guess. But in terms of like your mental well-being, when you are working through the process of forgiveness, it's just, you have a different perspective on life. In terms of like the risk factors that come from not being willing to forgive or struggling to forgive, there's a high rate of mental illness, depression, anxiety, like this constant worry. You'll find often people that struggle to forgive, they'll often have low confidence, low self-worth, low self-esteem. It does a lot to us as people. Not forgiving, how we replay that in our mind is actually super impactful, and has a lot of negative effects on us. Then biologically, physically, just the sense of having high levels of cortisol, constantly stressing, constantly being worried, like that does something to us biologically. You have a higher rate of heart disease among people who hold on to bitterness and resentment, who are angry. There's a lot of negatives to not forgiving, even though it can be quite painful to work through the process of forgiveness. But it's definitely the better of the two, is to just be open to the idea of trying to forgive someone for their offense.
Yeah, I know from my experience, I feel like the bitterness and like the mindset of like wanting vengeance in a sense is probably the thing that I found like the hardest to move through. But I feel like oftentimes you can forgive, but then you still have to like go through that period of healing those wounds.
Totally.
And so like I guess as your experience of a counselor, I'm sure most of the people who come to you have been hurt by someone and are grappling with this and are trying to go through that process. What is some of the advice that you give to people who are like going through that process of forgiving and like healing from those hurts? Like, what are there practical things that they can do to move through that?
Yeah, there's some real practical things. And then also, I think it's just, and I'm going to give a shout out to the book by Dr. Dick Tibbetts, Forgive to Live. I helped facilitate some community workshops with that book, not realizing that, you know, like just a few years later, there was going to be something massive that was going to happen in my life that was going to call for me to literally put into practice everything that I kind of let out with in that book. But that's a really helpful book. And one of the big things that you'll find even within that book is just even allowing yourself to consider forgiving someone is a massive step. And even just acknowledging that and being willing to consider forgiving someone actually helps to soften our heart to do the rest of the work that comes with forgiving someone. So practically consider forgiving them. And you know, even if you don't want to forgive them for their sake, understanding the benefits that come from forgiving someone for your sake can actually be a great motivator to get you to work through forgiveness, because the way that our interpersonal relationships are affected when we're holding on to bitter and resentment, the way that we're triggered in our day-to-day life because we don't want to forgive, because we haven't worked through that, can have like really detrimental effects just on our day-to-day existing. So yeah, I highly recommend it. So considering the possibility of working through forgiveness, then practically, like when we have a look at the Lord's Prayer in Luke 11, he specifically gives us this prayer of like, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And the Lord's Prayer, in essence, is almost a daily prayer that we should be making to God, for his will to be done, for the kingdom to come. All those key elements that are within the Lord's Prayer are something that we should desire daily. And forgiveness is part of that. Forgiveness is a daily thing. I'm daily committing to the fact that I'm going to try and consider forgiving this person. And as you slowly work through that, there are people, as I work through my list of people that I've had to forgive in my life, there are people that when I think of them, I actually feel quite sick, like my gut just sinks. And when I think of them and have that somatic response, I find myself, and I've kind of trained myself to say a prayer for them. Because there's obviously still something that's lingering there between me and that person. And so if I can say a prayer for them, I'm recognizing that, God, I haven't fully forgiven. And I'm still quite raw and fragile when it comes to even thinking of this person. So understanding how you feel when you think of that person can also help you to be at a place where you can be like, okay, I think there's some work that needs to be done there.
Yeah, it's interesting you say. I'm not sure where in the Bible. I'm not sure where in the Bible it says this, but somewhere in the Bible it says that when we sin, Jesus throws our sins into the depths of the oceans and he just forgets them, which is awesome and it's great for us. But I feel like as humans, we don't have that ability to just like completely forget and put all like of those things that people have done to us at the bottom of the sea away from our minds. And so I think kind of what you're saying is like sometimes forgiveness is like something that you have to do over and over again. Like you're saying, you continue to pray for people that come to mind that make you feel that way. And so I think we also have to continue to like, it's not just a once-off thing. Like sometimes we have to do it over and over again.
Yeah. And with that point, Zanita, you bring up something that's really interesting, which is this idea of forgiving and forgetting. We can talk about that a little bit more. But when you look at the three types of forgiveness that we see throughout the Bible, and primarily through the Old Testament, that's where there's this clearer distinction of the three. When you have a look at it, there's a forgiveness that's for the atonement of sins, which is that concept of blotting away, taking away, making them go into the depths of the sea. There's that type of forgiveness. And then there's also forgiveness that just says, you know what, we're just going to remove or pardon the punishment that comes with the sin, which is a little bit different to the full atoning, like blotting out of the sin. It's like, okay, let's be gracious in this form of forgiveness, which will then cause the punishment to be slightly different for that offender or for whoever sinned. And so when we look at forgiveness in the human concept, it's very different to forgiveness in the divine form of the forgiveness that God and Jesus have offered through the sacrifice of the Son of God. So that's a very different type of forgiveness, yet there's another form of forgiveness, which is the forgiveness that we can partake of, which is slightly different to that atoning forgiveness. So completely blotting out or forgetting what people have done can actually be more harmful than good. And I guess I put that out there with the, with the condition that there is still a way that we treat people who have wronged us or are an offender, but the punishment is still somehow infused with grace. There's still a way that we relate to them that reflects the goodness of God and what he has shown us. Because, you know, in Proverbs, and I just can't remember the chapter at the moment, but when it talks about wisdom is experience that you've gained that gives you knowledge. So if I have someone who has betrayed me, and maybe just give the example at a workplace, if I've seen that someone, you know, lies, makes up things about people, if I was to just forgive and forget them, then I place myself in a position where I could then become a victim again, because I'm forgetting what they've done, and therefore I'm actually missing out on the wisdom that I could gain from understanding that that particular person is not the most honest. Therefore, I'm going to be more cautious and be wiser around them to make sure that they don't end up doing what they did previously, or whatever that looks like. So yeah, carrying the wisdom of what we learn as a result of having to forgive someone is really important. And I believe that that's probably the idea of what forgiving is that we hold on to the wisdom and the lessons that we learned about ourselves and also about others, and use that to go into the next relationship, the next situation, with wisdom.
Yeah. Talk to us about the relationship between forgiveness and justice, because I think probably for most people, justice is the core issue that we grapple with when it comes to forgiving. But of course, as we know, the world that we live in is not exactly black and white. You know, what one person considers a great wrong, somebody else might consider to be a necessary action, a necessary evil, perhaps, or you know, there's so many shades of gray when it comes to our sense of justice. What I consider to be right might be considered by somebody else to be wrong, depending on, you know, context or culture or situation. So when we grapple with ideas of justice, how is that related to forgiveness, and how can we work through our own sort of sense of justice as we're considering, you know, whether we should be forgiving somebody or whether somebody, you know, needs to be forgiving us for stuff that we've done wrong?
Yeah. There's an example, and I'm just trying to think. It was the example of the servant that was pardoned for like a ridiculous amount of debt, and then by the king. And then when they had someone owing money to them, they were like, no, you need to make sure you pay me back. And like, you know, they were really right on to making sure that they made, you know, their debt, they reconciled it. And I think we always have to think of the heart of God, like the goodness of God, and the justice that he gives us for our faults, and how he treats us. We have to at some point try and somehow weave that into what that looks for us with our fellow humans. There's definitely, I guess, an example for us to always keep ourselves in check when we try and work out what is, what is just and what is fair of our dealings with someone else and how God relates to us. Now, when we look at the concept of forgiveness too, there was one that is more like pardon rather than forgiveness. And when you look at in terms of like a legal application, pardon is much more of the clearing their name. It's much more for the offender's reputation. And then forgiveness is, you've done the crime, you can still go to jail and I can still forgive you. You still are served justice in having to fulfill the conditions of your offense through whether it's a jail time or whatever that looks like. So there's still a part of justice that doesn't take away the consequence, which, for example, if I had a friend who betrayed me and now my form of justice and what I believe to be fair is that I'm no longer that person's friend, that's still a natural outcome of a betrayal within a friendship that wasn't reasonable to the point where I would consider being friends with that person again. So that might be my form of justice. Now, do I still desire for that person to be in heaven? Do I still pray for blessings on their life? Can I still demonstrate compassion for that person? That's where it gets a little bit harder. That's where, it kind of pulls on some like real painful strings in trying to desire good for them, even though the consequence is still going to be, it's going to be fair and just that I'm no longer friends with them. I think that's still reasonable. And I believe that, when we kind of put ourselves in a position where we have to work out where our boundaries are and how to protect ourselves from getting hurt again, sometimes there is, it'll be fair for me, but that person might still want to be my friend. But if I have to kind of lay down some boundaries, I think that still falls under, a fair call, because we're trying to work out how to protect ourselves. I don't know if that answered your question, Jesse, but.
No, it's good. It's good. A lot of food for thought there. Thank you.
I feel like forgiveness can often be tricky because we hear things like boundaries on top of it. And it's just not like it's not like you're just reading a step-by-step procedure and it's done. Our emotions are involved. And I think one of the most common verses that gets cited on forgiveness is when Peter is asking, how many times do I have to forgive? And Jesus responds, 7 times 70 or something. And which obviously is a hyperbole. I always forget how to pronounce this name. Hyperbole. For like
hyperbole.
It's never ending. It's never ending. Like there's no limit. So yeah, I think it is just obviously tricky to navigate. There's a difference, like you said, between
and straight after that passage where there's like this limitless forgiveness, straight after that passage is when you find this parable of the king that forgives a huge debt compared to the servant who doesn't want to forgive anyone. And when you look at the context of that, it's back to this idea of like this divine forgiveness and human forgiveness, to try and make it match up as much as possible, to try and make it be as much as a reflection of the divine as we can. And the essence is there, hey, like, don't limit your capacity to forgive people, because God's capacity is unending. Rather than do we put ourselves in a position with the same person to continually be hurt endless amounts of time because we've been told that we should be doing this. I think that there might be a slight variation of that when we look at the context of all the other passages that talk about forgiveness.
Yeah. When I was thinking about this conversation earlier today, I was thinking about, often when I think of forgiveness, I think of like the really big cases and like the really deep wounds. But then I was also thinking about, I was kind of annoyed at some small things someone I know had done, and how often that happens, that we are just like frustrated and angry at such small things that happen in our life. And I think the thing that like Jesus wants to do in us is to make us like forgiving in nature. So even these small things, we are more prone to forgive and have grace on people. But I guess, can you give us any advice, like just to finish up, how can we become more forgiving in nature, and like what can we do to kind of, I guess, just like heal, open our hearts, whatever?
I think the better that we understand forgiveness, the more forgiving we'll become. And I think that is understanding forgiveness of God's forgiveness for each one of us, but also understanding the freedom that comes in forgiving people. And, you know, there's a like this secular quote that says, not forgiving someone is like you drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And so when we see forgiveness in the wrong context and in a way that is quite unhealthy, which is, you know, forgive and forget. Like even that was like a quote that was started in the 17th century by some fictional Spanish author. And then Shakespeare used it in one of his plays, became a thing. And when we look at that through like a biblical lens and understand divine forgiveness and then human forgiveness, how we can infuse the two together, I think we'll understand what forgiveness really is, which will give us a capacity to be more forgiving and to be more understanding. There's so many benefits to be gained from experiencing forgiveness and giving forgiveness to others, that once you have experienced it, and because it's a journey, and like I said, like the Lord's Prayer, it's like a daily request of God giving us the ability to forgive people. As you experience that every day, weekly, monthly, and you see just how liberating it is to forgive people, not because you are accepting of what they did, not because you're downplaying what they did, or because you're invalidating your experience and the impact that it has had on you, but understanding that in recognizing your pain and recognizing your suffering and recognizing that there was an offense to your own moral law, then you can actually sit and be like, yeah, that was totally wrong. That was totally wrong. And because of that, like, I know how to navigate through life better so that those things don't continue to happen in my life. There's so much that, forgiveness has so much to offer. Like, I don't think we can do justice of how much it can do for our lives, but there's definitely a way to kind of work through that. And again, the Forgive to Live book, like I highly recommend it for people who don't feel comfortable going and seeing like a professional and going through therapy. That book was really, really helpful. And reframing and then forgiving yourself, because there's a part of forgiveness that also comes to us.
Awesome. Super helpful. Well, I'm sure there's many more questions we could ask you. Maybe we'll get you back for part 2 to go deeper. But thank you for your wisdom. We have run out of time, but yeah, thank you for your wisdom, and thank you for your early story at the start of the episode. And yeah, we hopefully will have you back on again.
Thank you for the invitation. You guys are awesome. I love what you do. I remember as a teenager, looking forward to when the record would arrive at our church and just reading about all the amazing things that the church is doing around Australia. And to see you guys expand to the online space and to recognize, where the audience is and how to provide in so many other areas than just, written format is just really cool. So thanks for what you guys are doing. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Awesome. Well, thank you, Catalina.
Thanks,
thank
Catalina.
you, Jesse, for jumping on. And
See you,
we'll see everyone next week.
Bye.